Okay, great. Well, it's a pleasure to be a part of an event devoted to the idea of shared visions of the future, because what people in my field, the history of science and technology, really do is to look at shared visions of the future from the past. Often we're not really so interested in the content of the vision, since visions of the future almost always turn out to be inaccurate, and really they're often not meant to be accurate. They're much more meant to persuade, to align people and resources and attention in order to accomplish more short-term aims. So really, instead of the vision part of shared visions, historians are much more interested in the sharing, the way that sharing of visions aligns resources, the way it creates communities in both inclusionary and exclusionary ways. We're also very interested in the types of people who manufacture shared visions, who mediate among different institutions in science and technology, government, industry, university, finance, and also the types of people, what my colleague Patrick McRae has called visioneers, who mediate between science technologists and the wider public. So to give you a little bit of a sense about how historians of science and technology talk about shared visions, what I wanted to do today is to tell a couple stories, one from the very beginning of my career, one from my current research. So this is from work I did as a graduate student on the history of a rather odd technology called the autogyro. Now the autogyro looks like, to some extent it was, a kind of a hybrid between the helicopter and a fixed-wing aircraft. It flew more or less like a fixed-wing aircraft, but it had some of the capabilities of a helicopter to land and to some extent take off in a very short space. But it was seen as safer and more intuitive to operate than a helicopter. So what shared vision was the autogyro part of? Well, in the 20s and 30s, there was a quite widespread movement among civic boosters and technological enthusiasts known as the AirMinded movement. The AirMinded, as they called themselves, believed that the world was on the verge of an era of mass, ubiquitous aviation, a world in which all of us would soon be commuting from our homes to our work with airplanes every single day of the week, and in which our skies would be clogged with three-dimensional traffic jams, and that situation of mass aviation would lead to the solving of many of society's problems. This was AirMinded vision. Was carried quite widely in popular culture through both sort of utopian and dystopian previews of coming events. So for instance, on the utopian side, this is a poster from the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. You can see it's really a very kind of air-minded view of mass aviation in the coming decades. From the dystopian side, this is H.G. Wells' novel, The Shape of Things to Come, which imagines the total breakdown of global society that's only gradually reversed by the creation of a world government led by air-minded pilots and engineers, whom he calls the air dictatorship. And he really meant that in very positive terms. He really thought that we would all be better off if we had a single global government run by technocratic, air-minded elite. Now, there are a number of objections one could make to the air-minded vision, of course. One is that airplanes are tricky to fly, and if you don't fly them quite right, you can find yourself in a pretty disastrous situation very quickly. Now, there were lots of technological fixes suggested for that problem, ways to make flying easier, safer, more intuitive. In the 1930s, the autogyro was really seen as one of the most promising technological fixes to enable mass aviation. Gyroists, supporters of the autogyro, including people like Amelia Earhart or Hiram Bingham, the discoverer of Machu Picchu, talked about the autogyro as a very safe technology that would enable people to commute from their backyards to work through the air in the next 5 or 10 years. The autogyro really was one of the most promising emerging technologies of the late 30s. If you'd gone to a TED conference in 1938, you almost certainly would have heard a talk about the autogyro. In the end, though, this vision of people commuting from their backyards to work through an autogyro really appeals mostly to people who have a backyard, have a job, and have the means to own an autogyro. And that meant that the autogyro was really not a vision that could be shared very widely in a world that was in the grips of the Great Depression. What eventually happened is that by the late 30s, gyroists could see that really their only promising market was going to be the world's militaries. And in general, when militaries looked at the autogyro, they decided that since safety was really not their highest concern, they would prefer either to have full-blooded fixed-wing aircraft or full-blooded helicopters. So the autogyro became an historical novelty rather than something that all of us use to get to work every day. Now, the autogyro story is, I think, instructive in a couple ways. One is, we shouldn't think that somehow the autogyro vision was inaccurate. Rather, it was unpersuasive. People looked at the autogyro and they asked the questions that are in the title of my talk. Whose vision is this? Who's sharing in this vision? Who's excluded from sharing in it? What are the people sharing this vision trying to persuade me to do? And in the end, most people came to the conclusion that they didn't like the answers to those questions. Nevertheless, even though in a very real sense the autogyro was a failed shared vision, it persuaded a lot of people to build institutions and align resources in the meantime. Some of those institutions, things that we take for granted today. So for instance, this is the 1940 control tower from Hobby Airport. Some of you may have seen it from today's terminals at Hobby. It includes a number of friezes, most of which are dedicated to various aspects of the AirMinded vision. And this one here is an autogyro, right? So even though the autogyro failed to come to fruition, it nevertheless contributed to the emergence of things like civic airports like Hobby. So that's my past work. My work today really is much more on occasions when very widely shared visions of science and technology start to become unshared. When constituencies that have agreed on a particular way of organizing science and technology start to disagree and their harmonious agreement starts to break down. In particular, I'm very interested in a quite widely shared vision of the role of science in American society and the proper way of organizing American science that came into being at the very end of World War II. It really permeated through American universities, industry, government, and was largely acceptable to the American public for more than 20 years, but which began to break down under the stresses of the Vietnam conflict in the late 1960s. The elements of this early Cold War vision for American science were basically this. Science, even very basic esoteric science, would be integral to winning the Cold War and defeating the Soviet Union. That belief was based in large part on the perception that even very esoteric sciences like nuclear physics had contributed to the development of war-winning technologies like nuclear weapons during World War II. Therefore, the US military was given free rein to fund dozens of different disciplines across universities, industry, and government laboratories at both the very applied end and at the very basic fundamental end of the basic applied spectrum. But when it came to civilian funding of science, civilian federal agencies were really encouraged to focus much more on basic research and to allocate their funds on the basis of meritocratic peer review. And that's because it was felt that federal support of civilian applied research would dangerously politicize American science and undermine the quality of American science. Nevertheless, it was recognized that basic research could and should contribute to the development of civilian technologies that would benefit American society. And therefore, very large tax breaks were given to American companies, especially large companies, to build palaces devoted to both applied and very basic research. Palaces of science such as this Eero Saarinen-designed IBM laboratory in upstate New York, and the famous Bell Laboratories complex in suburban New Jersey. Now, the elements of this paradigm of American science, as I say, they were very widely shared until the late 1960s, when basically every element that I've just outlined was annihilated under the pressures of the Vietnam War. First, the military began to look at its spending on basic research and came to the conclusion that they were really not getting a very good return on investment in basic research. Basic research was not helping the military as much as they had hoped win either the Cold War or the Hot War in Southeast Asia. Second, student activists, environmental and civil rights campaigners, liberal politicians began to argue that America faced an array of social problems, polluted air and water, decaying urban cores, racial segregation, complicated healthcare system, and that therefore the government should fund interdisciplinary teams of scientists to help solve those problems. And pressure was really very strongly put on university researchers in particular to turn away from work funded by the military and toward these so-called relevant social problems. And then finally, companies like IBM came to the conclusion that yes, corporate basic research could contribute to the development of marketable technologies, but often the companies funding that basic research were not the ones that were making a profit off of them. That often companies that did relatively little in-house basic research, companies like Intel or National Semiconductor, for instance, were able to pirate basic research away from companies like IBM and bring products based on that research to market more quickly. What followed then, with the breakdown of this post-war model for American science, was about 15 years, from about 1966 to 1983, of chaotic searching for a new shared vision of the role of science in American society and the proper way of organizing American science. People asked a lot of questions and looked for answers concerning what kinds of science should be done in America. So for instance, people asked if scientists should move away from Cold War topics, what topics should they move toward? Should they move toward topics like parapsychology, topics like psychokinesis, time travel, ESP? Should they look into the development of disability technologies like this reading aid for the blind? Should electrical engineers and physicists who had spent the early Cold War developing signals processing techniques to improve military radars, should they put that kind of project aside and instead focus on things like biomedical technologies? Similarly, should firms that had participated in the military-industrial complex, that had benefited from military patronage, should they move away from those patrons and toward civilian and consumer markets? And again, if so, what kinds of markets, what kinds of applications should they move toward? Companies like Texas Instruments that had benefited greatly from military sponsorship. In the 1970s, they began to experiment with new ways to connect with civilian markets. Texas Instruments, for instance, pumped tens of millions of dollars into a solar energy system for a domestic household. Also, some of you may be old enough to remember this, had a quite successful run with a pedagogical technology meant for young children, the Speak and Spell, about as far away from missile guidance systems as you could get, and yet depended upon some of the same digital technology. Similarly, people asked if universities should do something similar, if they should move away from military sponsorship, who should be their new patrons? Should it be civilian federal agencies, private philanthropies, large established companies, small new companies, state governments? Should universities turn their own discoveries into proprietary assets and try to fund themselves by revenue from that intellectual property? These were all things that people explored in the 1970s. And then finally, people asked, what should the role of government be in a world in which there were fewer taxpayer dollars to go around for science, and in which much of the taxpaying public was less willing to recognize benefits from the spending of their taxpayer dollars on scientific research? What emerged after 1980 was a new kind of social contract for American science, a new way of organizing the institutions arrayed around science in the United States, so-called triple helix of university, industry, and government, represented here by Bill Clinton, Gordon Moore of Intel, and David Baltimore of Caltech. That new paradigm basically said, yes, there should be continued federal involvement in science, but civilian funding should be much greater than it was, proportionally much greater than it was in 1970, especially for research intended to lead to biomedical innovation. Politicians could recognize that voters wanted discoveries that would prolong their lives. Companies began to trim down their commitment to in-house basic research, research that they had trouble converting into intellectual property, and to focus much more on near-term application and innovation, and to farm whatever needs they had for longer-range basic research out to corporate consortia and to universities. And universities began to reconceive themselves as loci of innovation, entrepreneurship, and proprietary research. Before 1970, basically no American research university would have used the word innovation anywhere in its description of itself. And yet today, virtually every American research university talks about its role in the innovation system. Now, this is, in many ways, a paradigm for science and technology that benefits us all. Certainly, each of the changes I've just described made a lot of sense in the context of the chaos of the 1970s. And yet, any shared vision of the future, any shared vision of where technologies come from and how science and technology should be organized to most efficiently produce discoveries and innovations, pretty much any shared vision of that sort is going to contain anomalies and unanswered questions. Questions that may be easy to ignore at one point, but which become unavoidable later on. That's what happened with the post-war paradigm of American science. The inconsistencies and anomalies in that paradigm were well known even in the mid-1940s, and yet they didn't become irredeemably problematic until the Vietnam era. I don't know if something similar will happen to the paradigm of American science that we have today, but let me finish by just raising a couple unanswered questions about this paradigm that may be worth a closer look. One question that hasn't really been answered fully, I think, is whether all knowledge ought to be proprietary or potentially proprietary and privatizable, or whether there are kinds of knowledge that ought to be treated as public goods. And if that's the case, how exactly should public and private institutions be configured so as to support the generation and diffusion of that kind of public good? And then the second question is, if every organization arrayed around scientific research in the United States wants to be seen as a locus of innovation, what are the implications of that? We should be asking innovation of what and for whom? But we should also be asking whether, if all of our research organizations want to be judged on their ability to innovate, does that create incentives against institutions that want to be judged much more by their ability to discover and enlighten? Thank you.